introduce the two presentations that are going to happen tonight. The first one is going to be a tag team between Alex Arduzer and Charlotte Westing, and they're going to talk about traps and how to take traps off, how to use traps, and what to do in case your dog gets caught in a trap. A lot of you might be familiar with it, but there's some pet owners here that aren't familiar with how to operate these traps, and it's not easy. So anyway, because it's that time of year, they're going to do a quick little presentation on how to operate those. And then afterwards, I guess I'll more formally introduce, you all know, if you want to stand up real quick, Alex Arduzer, one of the state troopers. He'll be helping with the trapping presentation. And then Charlotte Westing, many of you who are involved in the game management in town will meet her again Thursday night at the AC meeting. But she's the new state game biologist. She's Dave Crowley's replacement. And anyway, I've had the pleasure to work with her since June. She's sharp and quick and thirsty for data, and I think that'll show in this presentation that she gives tonight on the deer.
Okay. Well, thanks. So, yeah, I guess we'll get started first. Some people have asked me this year for a couple different things regarding this issue of traps and dogs and trying to avoid negative interactions between trappers and people who walk dogs on trails. So some of you may have noticed that we put up some of these signs at all the trailheads around town. They basically are just reminding trappers of the trapping code of ethics and reminding pet owners that ultimately it's their responsibility to ensure the safety of their pet, and the only way they can really do that is by having them on leash. But the second thing that people asked me for was a little clinic about what to do if your dog does get caught, so that you can minimize the chances of that being fatal. So, Trooper Arduzer is going to come at this time. People are so interested in this topic here in Cordova because a couple of dogs have died over two last winter, and then there have been some in previous years. So I think a lot of this can be addressed with prevention, and hopefully we can teach you something that maybe you didn't already know.
Well, I guess I'd just like to start off without pointing fingers at anybody. There's, especially in Cordova due to the weather or whatever, it seems like, especially in the winter, recreation, people that are outside get packed together, and that's trappers and dog walkers, skiers, snowshoers, whatever it may be. And basically, with that happen, all user groups have a right to be there, and there's potential that your dog could get caught in a trap. In this room here, there's people that are what I would call maybe not professional trappers, but on the verge of it, or that's their main activity around here in the winter. There's people that have lost dogs in this room, and there's also people that have caught dogs. I mean, we all seem to be getting along just fine here, but it just, in this small a group of people, we have all three here, and that wasn't planned. So I guess basically around here and really statewide, there's kind of three types of traps or sets that, I guess not really sets, but types of traps that you could run into. And I guess this is mostly geared towards if your dog gets caught. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but if it does, a little education, maybe it could save your dog, who knows, or maybe even you could recognize what's going on. There's some people that are, like I said, extremely avid trappers here, and there's some people that have probably possibly never seen a trap firsthand here. So, so this is a snare, and basically, I guess I'll back up one thing. Around here, it seems like if you're out recreating, my advice, if we have snow, if you see tracks and they seem to be in a random weird place, and you have a dog, you might not want to follow them. Or if you do have your dog on a leash, otherwise there's a decent chance that's a trapper. And so basically, this would be commonly set in a trail, like a blind set, or around bait. off of it, you know. Anyways, the idea is that the animal will run through, puts its neck in here, and this comes down, and basically this is caught around its neck, and this is kind of a, it can be released, but it's kind of designed as a one-way lock. The harder you pull on it, the tighter it gets. So what a lot of people say to do is to carry, and I guess basically once this gets tightened on your dog, it's once the fur gets jammed in this lock and the dog's probably going nuts, it's hard to get it backed off. So a lot of people say carry Leatherman if your dog gets caught, you know, and try to cut it. I have a piece of, this is basically a wolf snare. I have some cable here that's basically snare cable, but lighter than that stuff even, and you can see that, well, it actually worked good. But I guess this Leatherman hadn't been used much, but a lot of times you'll see a Leatherman, you'll sit there and off, you know, keep going, and it's just basically mashing the wire. You're not really getting too far. Something like this is kind of a fairly inexpensive cable cutter that you can get at a trapping supply store. If you're, you know, concerned about this, it might be worth buying a pair of these. It, you know, cuts it a lot easier. So basically, at least carry a Leatherman, or if not, invest in one of these. I think they're, you know, less than $10. The next thing you might run into is basically leg holds. These, as well as a snare, I mean, it's kind of unlikely that if you get to your dog and it's been snared, if you get there pretty quick, it's pretty, I would say, unlikely that it's going to kill it. Same thing with the leg hold. It's obviously it's designed to catch them on a foot. Yeah, it's going to hurt them, but not, you shouldn't lose your dog over this. And the principle behind all these, basically all leg holds is, you know, these are all different styles, but they all have 1 or 2 springs on the sides. And basically, when you push down on these, it releases the pressure. So.
Fish and Game's putting the finishing touches right now on a brochure that explains all of this stuff. If people are interested, I should have that within the next couple weeks, so you will be able to see that.
So everyone can see here, I mean, the idea is the animal steps on the pan there, and then the jaws come up, which are kind of, you know what you say, activated by the springs on each side. And as, I guess your dog would step in there, bam, it's caught, right? And this is its leg. And basically all these traps, if you can, I mean, it's obviously not a very big one, but the idea is if you can get pressure on these springs to push them down, see how the wood loosens up. So, and you can do that anyway. I mean, this one, maybe you can do it with your hands. A bigger one, you know, maybe step on it. And it shouldn't take much. I mean, the dog's going to be going crazy, and as soon as you get a little pressure off of there, it's probably going to come out. And I guess the other thing, especially with these two, you know, obviously be prepared. No matter how much you think your dog likes you, it's probably going to be pretty mad at the whole situation, and there's good potential to get bit, I guess. You might want to think about putting a coat over your head, or, you know, yeah. And then, so that's snares, leg holds. The third kind of trap we have is a conibear. It's, I guess, marketed as a killer style trap or whatever. It's really not. I don't know the actual statistics, but most animals that end up putting their head in here either are not killed instantly. So some people will tell you that you know, if your dog gets in there, it's dead. It could be. You know, I've seen dogs that have died pretty much, you know, it either knocked them out or, you know, I don't know, broke something in their spine or whatever. And I've also seen, you know, probably, I guess it was an 8-month-old lab put his head in one of those, and the owners weren't right there, and it survived just fine. So who knows what's going to happen. But I can assure you of one thing, it may not kill it, but you need to do something fairly soon because it's at least going to be cutting off its hair. So, I guess the best way to do that is to know how they work. And I guess I'll just explain. This is basically the same thing as this one, just different sizes, right? Come in 3 general sizes. This size, a lot of times you'll see associated with some sort of box or elevated set. This really shouldn't be too much of an issue for your dog or yourself. I mean, obviously don't put your hand in there, it'll hurt, but not going to really hurt you. But basically what it is there's springs on each side, and then these are safeties. As these springs are compressed, you put the safety on. Okay, so basically this thing's, what you're trying to overcome if your dog does get caught is you have to, how these were spread out before, that's locking the trap down on them. And you have to get these springs compressed in order for it to open up. So that's kind of the basis. I guess afterwards, or if you feel free to come by the office if you want to practice or something. I'm not super thrilled about people dinking with this one for a little bit, but I mean, if you want to use this and kind of figure out how it works, go for it. So basically what's going to happen, this is a dog. And I mean, obviously too, I don't know if you can see, I don't want to put it up here because it's kind of personal, but when you run into these in the wood, it's going to look probably something similar to this. It'll either be this or a bucket or a barrel or a lot of times a cubby kind of made out of brush or whatever. And there's usually bait in the back of this, and that's kind of why people have more problems with these than these. You know, dog that doesn't know anything smells something and goes by and puts their head in there. I guess that's the other thing. If you're out and about with your dog and you smell something that doesn't smell right, that's probably a good idea that you, not that you shouldn't be there, but maybe you should be cognizant of what your dog's doing, because it's likely somebody's trapped in there. And you know, that could either be a kind of a rotten smell or a skunky smell or lots of different smells. Anyway, so there's your dog going into this thing to get the bait, and okay, so now your dog's caught, right? And obviously there's a pretty good freak out factor here, so what do I do? The easiest thing to do is, if you were super concerned about this, you might carry a conibear setter with you, and you know, these are fairly inexpensive too, and you could hook this right here and right there, even one side, possibly enough to get your dog out, but both sides for sure. So that's one option. Another thing that a lot of people, if you have a dog, you might carry a leash. So, and I'll start by saying that although this is kind of the marketed approach to get your dog out, this is easier to talk about it than to actually do it, I would say. So basically, and that might be something, if you're out and about and you're around trappers, make sure that your leash, if you're going to use your leash, is big enough to go over because basically what you're going to do is want to hook it on one of these springs. And So, or you could loop this through the end. You could go like that, or if you didn't.
I've also seen a,
Like
through
that.
both loops and then back through both loops.
Huh?
I've seen them go through both loops and then back.
Yeah, there's, like I said, I've never actually know the proper way to do this. I just know that if you run it through the springs a couple of times, you gain some sort of mechanical advantage. And basically, as you, and I guess one thing is your dog is likely going to be laying like this. If you can get the trap more like this, you're going to have a better, more vertical, you're going to have a better, easier time basically getting some leverage on it. Basically, pull your leash. You know, it may be enough to just get the dog out or enough to get the safety on. And then dog. So, I guess that's really all I have. You know, I guess even a piece of rope. A lot of trappers will carry a piece of rope. If you were to catch yourself in a conibear, it's kind of the same principle. So, I don't have much else. Any questions?
I guess, so I'll just reinforce the thing that the only reason we're showing this demonstration tonight is just so if your dog is ever caught, you can release your dog. It's illegal to tamper with someone else's trap, to close someone else's trap, really to touch it.
Yeah, obviously, if you see one of these out in the woods, like going and practicing, this is
Yeah,
not.
that's not cool.
Like, yeah.
But we have these available. I think they're confiscated traps, right? Did you bring some of your own?
This is my stuff. So.
Well, we have some confiscated ones, and I'm going to put together a kit, fish and game, that people can come and look at. I'm going to have updates of the trapping brochure that has actual sketches of how these things can be done. It shows the leash technique that I was talking about. So those materials will be available. And, yeah, do we have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, if something like that happens, are we required to tell anybody that you said not to, you're not allowed to mess with it, but if you have to release your dog,
you
you have to
probably
tell somebody
should.
something?
It'd be a good idea.
It just helps us keep track of the issue and just whether, you know, we're all trying to gain on this issue by just education and talking to each other and figuring out how we can all share the trails. So it helps us kind of guide that.
I just want, I had to do this.
Is there a certain distance off the trail they're supposed to be, or?
No, there aren't really rules for that. There's some rules on, like Power Creek Road, you can use small traps within 100 feet and the bigger traps 200 feet. But other than that, it's pretty much, you pretty much don't consider anywhere safe to let your dog run once travel season opens.
What's the dates on the trapping season?
Basically, November 10th to end of February. It's kind of, it does run a little bit longer, but most people are concerned about these big conibears, which are generally wolverine sets, and that's the end of February. But you know, it does go later. You may run into snares in March.
Are the sets named? Does somebody have, do the trappers have to ID their set?
No.
Are you
Or marked. They don't have to be marked either.
Are you familiar with the case that just happened overnight where the Cooper Sear was, did you read that whole?
I read the newspaper,
Yeah,
so you
same
know
here.
as
What's
much
your-
as I know.
I mean, if that's correct, I mean, he could come right in here and set a trap right there, totally legally. I mean, what's your take on that?
I think that's a little bit far-fetched, your example, but I guess basically what I would chalk it up to is, you know, there's things that are legal to do and things that aren't legal to do, and some of our social norms are more stringent than those, and basically, ethically, should he have done that? You know, maybe not. That's everyone's call, you know, own personal call, but you know, legally he was in the right, the landowner, owner wasn't. It's similar to this, basically, your dog got caught and you're actually the one breaking the law. Your dog should have been on leash. So, is
Well, I
that,
mean, the way the newspaper article was read, somebody could come in your front room and put a trap right in the middle of your front room, and it's totally legal because you didn't have your property properly. I mean, there's a lot of requirements for a no trespassing sign, name,
Yeah.
phone number, date, and I don't know anybody in Cordova that has their name, phone number, date on the door of their house.
it's actually,
Isn't that bizarre? I mean, I just.
no,
kinda
Alaska,
make it fun,
Alaska's
you know?
interesting, and that's that there's very few people that get charged with trespassing, because when you really break it down, there's,
So what this is referring to is that there's a case going on in the valley right now where a trapper was trapping on someone else's gravel pit, basically, without their permission. And they, basically, what it's come down to is what he's done is not against the law. It's not even against trespass law, because there wasn't adequate signage at that site to indicate that there was no trespassing private property, they don't want people on there. What he no doubt violated, I think all parties will say, is the Trappers Code of Ethics, which says that trappers should consult with private landowners before they make sense on their property. The other thing that Trappers Code of Ethics says is that trappers should avoid trapping in areas where they can have negative impacts with other users. So just being sensitive to where other users may be wanting to be and setting your traps with respect to that. So we can encourage people all we want to use the Trappers Code of Ethics. Whether or not they do at the end of the day is up to them. Yes.
Hello.
So, okay, I think most of you really want to hear about deer, so I'm going to go ahead and start talking about that. But thanks to Shabard here for his being my lovely assistant this evening with the demonstration. I'll give you all a little background about myself. I'll try to speak as loud as I can, and I guess there's nothing we can do about folks that don't have seats. But my name is Charlotte Westing. I've worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for about 10 years now. I'm coming down to you now from Coxview, where I've worked for the last 5 years as the area management biologist up there. I've spent time in Dillingham and King Cove, Kodiak, and we're really excited to be here in Cordova and to make this place home. So as soon as I showed up here in mid-May, people started asking me about the deer population. Part of that is because I had to start diving in immediately, and some of the first field work that I was doing were deer pellet transects. So I want to talk to you all tonight about a few different things relative to Sitka, black-tailed deer, and Prince William Sound. So basically, I'm going to give you a summary of what we think we know, what we really don't know, what we wish we knew, and then what we've done about what we've learned. So first I'll give you a little bit of background about the basic biology of Sitka black-tailed deer. Then I'm going to give you an overview of population assessment techniques just in general, including those that we don't use here, because I think that some people have a question about how good are deer pellet counts at doing what we want them to do, and why don't we use some other techniques. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that. I'll also talk to you about deer following the 2011-2012 snow event, which I'm sure most of you really remember and maybe still have sore backs from. I'll give you an overview about harvest assessment techniques, what we've learned and what still has us stumped, and then talk about just the theory of deer management, what we can control, what we can't control, and just explain to you where I'm coming from on that. And then I'd like to explain this year's management action, what we did and why we did it. And then finally, how you all can play into this process, what you can do to help. So first off, a little bit of background about Sitka black-tailed deer. There are subspecies of mule deer. The scientific name is there for you, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. They're native to rainforests of southeast Alaska and coastal British Columbia. They're not native to Prince William Sound. They occur at the northernmost extent of their range. And one of the reasons why we don't think they ever got here by their own means is just the amount of snow and the duration of retention is just, it doesn't give them access to the food that they need, and it impacts their movement. So on their own they never got here, but humans brought them here, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. They're smaller, stockier, and have a shorter face than other mule deer. They also have average weights of about 80 pounds for does and 120 pounds for bucks. Their average lifespan is 10 years, but it can be as long as 15 years. So, one of the really noteworthy things about Sitka black-tailed deer are some aspects of their reproduction. So, their breeding season peaks in late November, and females generally breed in their second year of life. So if you compare a Sitka black-tailed deer to a moose that may not reproduce till 3 years old, 4 years old, or a goat that may not reproduce till 6 or 7, these animals are really able to replace themselves quickly because of this element of their life history. They produce fawns until they're 10 or 12 years old. Fawns are born in early June, and then does between about 5 years in age and 10 years in age oftentimes produce 2 fawns when they have a fawn. Here's a nice picture from Milo here. So for habitat, they like to have they need uneven aged old growth forest, less than 1,500 feet in elevation. So basically what that creates is gaps in the forest canopy that allow undergrowth to develop, but it protects the canopy itself, prevents the accumulation of a ton of snow. And so the combination of those two events, the gaps in the uneven aged forest, gives them the sweet. It gives them the access to food resources and prevents the snow from really getting to be too bad. It still will be too bad though if they get enough accumulation. So when they do get heavy snow accumulation, they may congregate in heavily timbered areas or on the beach during those deep snow events. There's been some question over the year about seasonal migrations, and we've looked into it a little bit. There's been some radio collar studies that have been done, and nothing that we've found so far really supports that there is a seasonal migration. Coming down from Kotzebue, I was part of monitoring the western Arctic caribou herd and watching these massive migrations of 400,000 animals across the northwest Arctic. We don't have anything like that going on in Prince William Sound. I think it's pretty safe to say. But what we do see is when the population's high, animals, and generally it's young animals, tend to pioneer new areas, find new places to be and to eke out their existence as a deer. Another thing we find is when the population's lower, the deer population tends to be more restricted to the islands. When the population gets to be pretty high, we find more deer on the mainland in general. You'll still find deer on the mainland even when times are tough. I've heard reports about deer on the mainland around here even now, so it definitely happens, but not their preferred place to be. So what do they eat? Well, in the summer, they feed on herbaceous vegetation and green leaves of shrubs, including sweetgale and blueberry. Sweetgale wasn't previously documented as a really significant portion of their diet until a couple years ago when a science student at Cordova High School did a science project on analyzing the stomach contents of Sitka black-tailed deer and found a high amount of sweetgale that hadn't really previously been documented in the literature. Other good summer foods they like are false lily of the valley, skunk cabbage, gold thread, twayblade, ferns, grasses, and sedges. South-facing slopes are real good for them. Generally have better plant growth, warmer winter temperatures, less snow, and the first to melt. Coming out of the summer, and just after the rut, does tend to be in pretty good body condition. The bucks will tend to have worn down their reserves though, basically with all their rutting activities. So going into the winter, your does are going to be a lot more capable of withstanding the pressures of whatever winter brings than your males will. And that's why in general, males don't tend to have as good, they have higher mortality in general. So, and they're a little bit more expendable in the population anyways. Don't hurt things. Winter, they feed on evergreen forbs such as blueberry, yellow cedar, hemlock, or boreal lichens and kelp, but those are not necessarily their preferred food resources. They're just something that they'll use when they gotta have something. So, on to the local history. Sitka black-tailed deer were introduced to Prince William Sound between 1916 and 1923. It's a little bit fuzzy because there are a couple different ways that we think they may have gotten here. Some of you may have seen pictures of a young boy with a border collie in this time period. Basically, down in Sitka, this kid's job was to chase deer with his dog out into the water, and once they got in the water, they'd scoop them up with a boat and hobble them, and they got transported here. There's also some speculation that some commercial fishermen also brought up deer, and deposited them in various different places, but we know that at least 24 deer were placed on Hawkins and Hinchinbrook Islands. And we believe that the population, local deer hunting, began in 1935, and we believe that the population peaked around 1945. One interesting thing, when I was poking through notes at Fish and Game, is I saw a memo from 1952 where the biologist talked about the fact that he could not convince people in this community to kill does. And it was one of the things that, basically in 1945, they feel like they got to a point where the population actually exhausted the habitat and did some permanent damage. And he was just wringing his hands saying, I can't convince these people to shoot does. And now we're in a situation where I think most people here don't have a problem shooting does. But they were really focused on growing the population. And the amount of harvest that you apply to females is the single biggest factor in affecting the trajectory of your population that humans can have an impact on. So we started collecting harvest data in 1960, and by now they're the most important game species in Unit 6. Participation averages about 1,300 hunters from all parts of Alaska and some from other parts of the country or the world. Harvest averages about 1,600 deer, but it can vary between 1,200 and 1,900. For Cordova specifically, Cordova takes about 600 deer, so if you do the math on that, it's about 24,000 pounds of tasty organic meat in all of our freezers. So it's a very valuable resource and something people really see as a good thing to have around here. Season is August 1st through December 31st for the resident bag limit of 5 deer. Females can only be taken after October 1st. But occasionally seasons are superseded by emergency order closures, and that's been the case the last 2 years. This year, females can only be taken during the month of October. So now I'd like to move into explaining how we do our monitoring efforts here. One of the things in doing some background research for this presentation is monitoring mule deer of any subspecies is challenging in all areas. In the lower 48, mule deer biologists get together and they wring their hands and talk about these issues. How do we monitor this population? And one of the things that's consistently debated is whether or not you need to come up with an actual population estimate, or if you can use habitat assessment and other trend monitoring to tell you what you need to know. Are you hunting too much? Do you need to hunt more? What kind of adjustments do you make? And so that's something that's constantly up for debate. But I'd like to highlight some of the different techniques that are used and just explain what they are and then why we don't use them here. And the primary reason why we don't use most of these techniques here is the presence of old growth forest and just the challenges that old growth forest presents to us. And then also connectivity. We don't have a bunch of roads that are going through all this habitat that is breaking it up and giving us a lot of access points. So here's a list of different techniques that are used. First off is just a minimum aerial count. So that would basically just involve flying over an area, counting as many deer as you can, and just saying, well, I know at least this many deer are here. This approach can work in areas where you have really open habitat and good sightability, but that's not the case here. Even in areas that they have good sightability though, they've done comparisons between what a minimum count found and then what you know is there based on your radio collar data, and they haven't found people to be very good at seeing what's really there. And then of course there's a lot of observer variability to deal with. So minimum aerial counts are a technique. We don't use them here primarily because we don't have areas that would be good to look at them in. We just don't have areas that are that pre-covered. Spotlight surveys and ground counts are techniques that are used, and they work well in areas where you have a lot of fragmented habitat, area that's broken up by lots of roads. Not something that we have here, and personally I'm thankful for that. Harvest per unit effort is something that can be used, but it's reliant on having really good harvest data. So when I talk to you in a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of our harvest data, I think you'll understand more why that's not an option. Track surveys rely on identifying the intersection of a one-way path of a deer across a road and using that information to extrapolate to a population. Again, no roads, doesn't work for us here. A radio collar-based capture marker capture study would basically involve going out to numerous locations throughout Prince William Sound, capturing animals, putting a radio collar on them, and then doing surveys that go back to that minimum aerial count technique where you try to look for as many deer as you can, and then when you pick up a deer that has a radio collar on it, you use the information about that sample, the animals that are collared, to deduce how much of your population you've seen. So again, it has the problem that it depends on having those open areas where you can see a bunch of animals. We don't have that. But the second problem with radio collars is that they are expensive. A radio collar costs between $1,000 and $4,000. We probably need about 200 collars to do a good sample size and distribution in Prince William Sound. So about $200,000, and that's just to buy collars. That's not any of the cost with me hanging out a helicopter and darting deer and hanging collars on them. None of the costs of actually going out and doing the follow-up surveys. Then you also got to think about the weather that we deal with in Prince William Sound, and how would you ever shoot the gap and get those weather windows. So that one I don't really see as an option either. DNA-based capture marker capture. So that would involve deploying a bunch of areas where deer could rub up against and maybe deposit some fur. And then we would go out to those areas and collect that fur and use the same capture marker capture technique to deduce how big our population was. Well, the two problems there, the expense of deploying those sites, then going back to those sites, which would probably require multiple revisits, and then finally the lab time, because they'd have to genetically sequence everything they got and figure it out. And then I also wonder about the fact that, you know, we started from a pretty limited population, and I'm wondering how much genetic diversity we have in the population. So it might be kind of a tricky thing to do. I'm not sure. I'm not a geneticist, but. Another technique that's used is thermal imaging and aerial photography. It hasn't really been used by anyone successfully yet. And I think it would be a real problem to use it here because, again, of the cover. The satellites wouldn't necessarily be able to see anything that's underneath that. And the thermal imaging thing. Basically, it hasn't worked for anybody yet. And then our other problem is the weather that we deal with doesn't necessarily get clear shots. Distance sampling or other sampling schemes. Distance sampling is an approach that is used for lots of different wildlife biology. I used it on muskox the last 5 years. And it basically involves sampling along a transect, and at some point on that transect you assume that you have a 100% chance of seeing what's there. And then you use the information about the swath of that transect where you have 100% detection to extrapolate to the distance from your transect. You have what we call a deteriorating detection function with distance from the transect. You are less likely the further you go to a transect to see what's there. But you can use that to develop a population estimate. But it doesn't work for us because, again, 100% detection. I'm not flying over, you know, mountaintops in the Arctic that are snow-covered and looking for black animals. I'm looking for deer underneath the forest. Even doing that from the ground would be pretty challenging. Modeling efforts have to be grounded in some sort of numbers that you can really hang your hat upon, whether that's a harvest estimate or mortality estimate or farm production or something like that. You have to have some numbers to ground them in reality, and we just simply don't have any. So, on to what we use, and actually the technique that's used everywhere that deer exist in old growth forests, and that's deer pellet transects. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. One thing about deer pellet transects is they have been correlated with aerial counts, and they've been correlated with hunter observations. There are some peer-reviewed studies that do that. One thing that we never use deer pellet transects for is giving you a hard and fast population estimate. What we say that deer pellet transects do for us is they're just an index that allows us to have a general idea of what's going on with the population. And it may not be able to detect really fine changes, but it can detect something big. And in detecting something big, those are the times that we need to maybe exercise some management action. So it tells us what we need to know when we need to know it. The little bounces that happen over time are less important to us, and that's probably where it doesn't do very well. So I'll tell you a little bit about the technique. So deer pellet counts have been conducted since 1988. Each location that we do the deer pellet transects has 3 to 5 transects. So a transect is a line and it extends from the coast to the alpine. Every transect has a fixed starting point. So these are actually trees that are labeled with orange swaths and usually also in metal placards. And we use that same tree every year to start off the transect. We use the same compass bearing every year for each specific transect. And that was all determined a long time ago, way before I was, well, I'll tell you what I was doing in 1988. Excuse me. Each team has a 2-person team with 1 member that's responsible for taking that compass reading and making sure they're walking in the right direction. They pull the cable behind them, they carry the gun for bear deterrent. The second person comes up behind them. So the person walks the length of the cable, the person that stays behind tells them when to stop, and then they stop and they wait and drink a little bit from their Camelback and maybe crunch on their granola bar while the other person walks the transect line up to their buddy that's waiting and looks for deer pellets within half a meter of either side of that transect. So you get 1 data point for each 20-meter pole of transect. So if you're walking and you see 7 piles of poop on that transect, then you would write down on your data sheet number 7 for that pole. And that's basically how it works. We do these surveys in usually late May, but we try to do it, we have to throw out transects that have extensive snow cover. When we get into areas that have 100% snow cover, we just throw in the towel. So we want to shoot the gap between maximum snow depth that we can, or sorry, maximum snow gone that we can, and then we want to get out there before the Devil's Club and other plants really start to leaf out. So we really hit a magical time because you can actually get in there and hike around and see a lot. We see the pellets before they start getting covered up, and it's just a neat time to be walking around out there. So these are the sites that we go to. Milo made me switch to some bigger symbols in case there are people in the audience that have a little trouble seeing. So there's some overlap on these, but you can see there are 3 at Northeast Hawkins. We've got 1 at Shipyard here, a couple at Orchid Creek, and 1 at Windy Bay. And then we've got 3 on Southwest Hawkins, 3 here at Hook Point, 3 here at Fort Etches. They're 4 at Fort Etches. Right? 3, 4.
3 in Fort Etches. There's 4 and we've got 2 in Windy Bay.
Okay. Couple in Rocky Bay, 3 in Rocky Bay, 3 in San Juan, 3 at Night Island, and 3 in Macon. So that's where we go. So it takes float planes to access some of those locations. It takes skiffs and multi-day vessel charters, and it takes a whole lot of trail bikes because we're hiking from coast to alpine and going through blowdowns and up cliffs and all kinds of exciting stuff. We do it with help from the U.S. Forest Service. They provide both money for, especially for wheeled flights, or well, any kind of flight, and then also provide usually 50% of the staff on any crew that's fishing U.S. Forest Service staff. I usually have to bring in additional fish and game staff. I usually recruit my husband as a volunteer, and then I've used other members of the community as a volunteer. And if you're free in May, late May, early June, and would like to go on one of these surveys, there's a good chance that I will be looking for someone, so call me up. This here is a pile of pellets within a half a meter of this transect, so it can be counted, and that's a beautiful thing. So, but that is not all. We use that information in addition to a whole bunch of other things, and most of that we get from local people talking to us about what they're observing. Body condition, sex ratios, observations of the harvest, observations of harvest per unit, effort, wounding loss, carcass reports. The initial estimates of the mortality from the 2011-2012 event were all based on local observations. People calling Dave, people calling Milo and saying, gosh, I think this winter's been really hard on deer. I'm seeing a lot of dead deer, I don't like what I'm seeing. Another thing that year when deer pellet transects were done, they saw a ton of carcasses. It's usually pretty noteworthy to just find one or two. They found numerous carcasses at different sites. I included a little picture here of a carcass. I don't know, it just seemed like a good idea. You can see the deer here and the snow that they were dealing with that year. So it was a pretty big deal. So what do we end up with at the end of the day? Well, this shows you from 1995, and I've used 1995 as a starting point because that's the year we started looking at all of the same areas that we're looking at now. And you can see how these have changed over time. You can see, well, there's always a 1-year lag effect. So you can see the two high points that we have here, one in 1998, one in 2011. They have an initial drop, and then they have a bigger drop after that. And so what happens is this is not really that we think the population was here following the 2011 snow event. Actually, the population was probably somewhere in here. But deer poop the whole winter before they die, and the deer pellet counts will count that poop, not realizing that a lot of those deer didn't make it and they're dead. So the year that you really see how bad it was is the following year. So there's that 1-year lag time. So it's an indication, again, this technique's an indication of trends, but reliably it can only detect something really huge. So this is not to say that from 2006 to 2007 we think the population may have declined slightly. We don't say any of that. In this window here, things were probably pretty stable. But we know that this was probably real. We know that this was probably real. And a big part of that is that it's grounded in the reality that people share with us about their local observations. And that's pretty powerful in the whole scheme of things. Most users say that these deer pellet data match what they believe to be true. I also think it's really interesting the pattern of both 1998 to 2000 and 2011 to 2013 did. And I'm curious how it will hold up in future years here. It's going to really depend on what kind of winters that we see. But keep that pattern of 1998 to 2000 in mind, because I'm going to show you some weather charts in just a second here. So, we're going to do it. So winter of 2011, 2012, most of you probably remember. I wasn't here yet. But I heard a lot about it. And it's part of the reason why I probably have this job now, because Dave got sick of shoveling snow down there. I took weather data, and I found weather data for both the Cordova Airport and also for Cordova proper. I used only the weather for Cordova itself to do this weather analysis, and then I looked at it two different ways. I looked at the sum of monthly total snowfall, but I didn't want to look at that alone, because if we got snow but then we got rain, or it got snow but it warmed up and melted down, it might not be as big of a deal. So I looked at the sum of maximum monthly snow depth too. And they both tell pretty much the same story. 2011 was off the charts, huge. But the other big year you see here is 1998. 1998 was a big year. I don't know what to think about 1968. I looked back, and basically the data in between 1958 and 1986 is very unreliably collected. So in the future I'm going to just clip that out. But it wasn't until I started really tracking your presentation that I noticed that. So I only consider what's right of 1986 for the purposes of this discussion. 10 feet of snow in 2 weeks, records for both snowfall and retention. So now I'm going to show you the chart with the deer pellet graphs, the mean pellet groups per plot for all areas combined. And then I'm just going to let specific areas throughout the sound where we load up. So that way if you have a special honey hole that you're interested in, you can just spend a little time looking at it. But basically, what we saw is pretty much all areas saw the lowest point that they had on record, or one of the lowest points that they had on record, and it seemed a pretty consistent story across the board. So, the results by island, you can see that Hinchinbrook had the highest mean pellet groups per plot, followed by Hawkins, then Naked Island, then Montague, and then Night Island. And that seems to hold up with what people believe to be true. Hinchinbrook and Hawkins are generally considered to have the best habitat for deer anyways, so it seems like their mean pellet group per plot should be higher. Night Island is really rugged habitat. It makes sense to me that Night Island doesn't have very high population densities or mean pellet groups per plot. I can't really speak to the population densities, but low mean pellet groups per plot. So that all kind of adds up to what we believe to be true. We think that snow was believed to have affected deer more in Prince William Sound. I think it wasn't as noticeable on those charts because they were already at a low level, so they just didn't have as far to drop. And then again, there's some question about whether or not this correlates with actual population densities. It's anybody's guess, but it's the best guess that we have. So now I'd like to change course a little bit and talk about harvest monitoring. We began harvest monitoring in 1960, and from 1960 to 1979, harvest monitoring was done with hunt reports and hunter calls. So we can call Julie's run walking down on the dock and saying, hey, how'd you do? After 1980, we started using harvest surveys. So this would basically be a lot like what you might get after buying a hunting license, or sport fishing license, you might get a survey, or duck stamp, you might get a survey. Well, a portion of people who picked up a deer harvest ticket would also get a survey. And they were asked questions about what they got and where they got it, kind of a map where they could put the location of the deer. How many people have ever filled one of those out? Okay. So the response rate from those was about 60%. And so one of the things that they had to do was, since not everybody got a survey, they had to take the information from the people that they surveyed and expand that to represent all the people that went hunting. And one thing that we always have to be careful about when we're talking about expanding surveys based on a sample is the possibility of what we call non-response bias. What that basically means is that the people who are least likely to return their surveys are the people that either didn't go hunting at all or went hunting and didn't get anything because they're thinking, why does it matter? I didn't get anything. I'm not going to deal with that paperwork. So we can't assume that those people got the same thing that all the people that reported to us did. We have to recognize the possibility for non-response bias. The second thing is that there's variable reporting compliance. When I've talked to some folks about what I believe our harvest is here, they'll say, harvest information is horrible. People tell you what you want to know. We don't have good information. People aren't responding to that. Maybe that's the case, maybe not, I'm not sure. But there are some parts of the state that I think would probably characterize it pretty good from those people that are hunting in Prince William Sound. Others who probably aren't doing as well. So those are all factors that we have to consider. And when they were doing the survey data, they were expanding information relative to where you lived. So if you lived in acreage, there was one expansion factor applied to your data, and there's a completely different expansion factor applied to a person who wrote. Recognizing the different ways that people hunt and the different characteristics of their harvest, which I'm going to go into in just a minute here. Starting in 2011 and now in present, we use harvest ticket reports. So this is just like any other general season harvest ticket that you pick up around the state. It has the overlay portion that you write on, it has the harvest ticket portion that you punch with your knife, and then it has the third piece, which is the harvest report that you mail in or report online these days. So now we expect everyone to give us their report. There's no more sampling. Everybody needs to get their report in. We find that we have about a 60% reporting compliance. We send follow-up letters and try to urge people to send in reports, but we end up at about 60%. Excuse me. So now we deal with the question of expansion factor application. What do we do about the fact that only 60% of people have talked to us about how they did? We still have the potential issue of non-response bias, but the other thing we're dealing with is the fact that we're not sampling anymore. We're expecting everyone to return their reports. So kind of a whole different ball of wax, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. We still have the possibility of non-response bias. I would argue that it's probably even a little bigger because people don't really see that picking up a harvest ticket and not reporting will have any consequences for them. If they're selected for a survey, they may have taken that a little bit more seriously. So we don't apply expansion factors to any other kind of harvest ticket data, and some people feel like we shouldn't treat deer any different, but we want to have the most comparable data that we have, and since we change techniques, we have to consider what's going to lead to the most comparable information, how can we get the most complete information. And actually I have to go to Anchorage on Friday to talk about all of these issues. We're still working some of these things out. So I'll tell you what the best guess is about what we know right now. 2011, 2012 is going to have an asterisk by all of that, and that's just indicating that we switched to a new data collection technique in that year. So who hunts Prince William Sound deer? First off, I got to give you a couple of definitions. The green bars are your non-residents, so those are people that don't live in the state of Alaska. Red bars are your non-local residents, so people that live in Alaska but not in Unit 6. And blue bars are Unit 6 residents. Does everybody know what Unit 6 is? Basically covers all of Prince William Sound and then Copper River Delta and all the way over to Icy Bay. So, but for all intents and purposes, it's people who live in Valdez, people who live in Whittier, Chenega Bay, Titlik, Cordova. That pretty much gets everybody that lives in Unit 6. So what you see is a third of the participation is people from Unit 6. So 2/3 of the participation in this hunt are people that don't live in Unit 6. So now how much is harvested? Well, even though only a third of the participants, the people that go hunting, are Unit 6 residents, you see 40 to 50% of the harvest is by Unit 6 residents. The rest is from your non-local residents. About 40% of the total in any given year is does harvested. So well, non-local residents and local residents both take about the same amount of does. So who is the most successful? We can see here that Unit 6 residents tend to take more deer. 2.5 deer for 2011. Got to put that half deer out of its misery on the beach. Tough crowd. And then the non-local residents, it's more like 1.5. So again, the half deer issue. So you may be wondering where that harvest is coming from. And this, I think, will come as a surprise to some people that live in Cordova. I broke down the harvest by island. So you can see that Montague is a real significant portion of the harvest. Over, I think it's 486 were taken. That's a 5-year average harvest. Then you can see Hawkins coming up behind that, and then Hinchinbrook. And then the western Prince William Sound, it gets a lot of pressure from, especially from hunters in Whittier, hunters in Seward. So one thing I'll show you in just a minute here is just that this is to break down the harvest data just a little bit farther and give you a little bit more of an idea of where they're going at any given place. So you can see there's a lot of focus on this northern part of Montague and on Green Island here. Hawkins obviously gets a lot of attention, particularly by Unit 6 residents. Hinchinbrook's very popular. Naked Island, very popular. And then you can see this funny yellow here. A fair amount of harvest coming from Esther Inland and the east side of Port Wells. And that's basically proximity. It's not that there are a lot of deer there. It's just that the deer that are there have a pretty good chance of getting hammered. So I always advise people to keep that in mind. Harvest may be more of a product effort than population density. So one thing that's changed with the change from the sample scheme and the survey data to the current scheme now with harvest tickets is that we used to give people that map and say, write down the code for the area that you went hunting. And we get specific information because it was broken up into these units. Well, now people are supposed to report on a harvest ticket and it says, where did you hunt? And I get everything from in the effing state of Alaska to Prince William Sound to Unit 6 to Montague to Rocky Bay to that creek to GPS coordinates. I get the whole range. And the bottom line I want you all to know is when you send in your report for anything, the more specific you can get, the more that will help me understand what people are getting and where. So this further proves the point about harvest being more of a product of effort sometimes than population density. You see this orange here. This is the number of hunters that hunted in western Prince William Sound. You can see there's just a lot of effort, over a quarter of hunters. That's 100 days. So if you're one guy and you go hunting for 3 days, you count as 3. So a lot of effort in Washington. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about this concept of deer management. First off, just why do wildlife managers exist? I believe that wildlife managers exist because we need to inventory and assess the health of populations, animal populations, especially in the threats of different kinds of development or resource extraction, and just making sure that what we're doing is compatible with sustainability of that resource in perpetuity. And so I think that's our fundamental role. But then the second role that people expect from us is that wildlife management in its long history it's sought to take the wild oscillations that animal populations can do when they build up to these high points and then they can exhaust their habitat and crash subsequently, and smooth those out. We still want animal populations to oscillate. That's what's healthy for them. But we want to smooth them out to an extent to where they fall within a range that people can consistently have access to a resource. And I think that's what most people expect a wildlife manager at least to attempt to do. I'll never tell you that I truly manage wildlife. I feel like what I really do is manage people. And I try to manage the amount of what type of harvest is applied. See, I'm not like Storm here harnessing the weather and X-Men. I can't hold the big snow events at bay, but I can focus, or try to focus, whether or not the type of hunting pressure that we put on our animal populations is what we call compensatory or additive. So these are wildlife management concepts that basically compensatory harvest is focusing harvest on animals that were likely to die anyways or had a higher chance of dying anyways. Part of the North American model of wildlife management. It's part of why a lot of hunts, or most hunts, focus on the males. Because again, you guys are a little bit expendable. At least in other species. So focusing the harvest on animals that were likely to die. That's different than additive harvest. And additive harvest is harvest that happens in addition to animals that were going to die. You put more of them on top of that. We never really know what we're going to get. You never know when you shoot an animal. Well, sometimes you know if you shoot a bone rack, whether or not it's going to make it. But sometimes we make investments, and we have to take a risk associated with that investment. Maybe it's going to pay off, maybe it won't. But it's like your stock portfolio. Yeah, if you put money into it, you're hoping that that decision is going to pay off in the long run. Another consideration that I have to deal with is a constitutional mandate to manage the resources of Alaska for all Alaskans without consideration of where a hunter lives. So what we did this year, we focused our harvest on bucks only after October 31st. I did this because I wanted to recognize the fact that there was a high potential for additive harvest. We knew our population was low. Again, based on what the deer pellet counts told us, and then also just what people that were walking in and out of the office were telling us. The population's down. This year I've gotten a lot of hunter reports and people are telling me things are maybe getting a little bit better, but it's still pretty slim pickings out there. One good thing they're telling me though is that what they are finding is in good body condition. I've had people send me pictures of deer with inches of fat. Just really looks good. They have less competition for food resources, and so things are looking better for them. We wanted to reduce the harvest of females, knowing that that would have the highest potential impact on the trajectory of the population. It could mean the difference between 3 years or 8 years to recovery. So again, the application of the appropriate amount of harvest on females is one of the fundamental principles of wildlife management. It's the one thing that we know we can influence that has the highest impact on the trajectory of the population. Take too many of the females, the population's going to go down. Sometimes that's what we want. We want our population to go down a bit because of habitat concerns, but if we want our population to grow, minimizing our harvest on females is a great way to do that. So I had to decide how to do that. So I recognized, looking at this non-resident doe harvest, that non-local resident hunters focus a lot of their harvest on does in November. If you compare that to your Unit 6 residents, they focus more of their harvest on those in December. And so by encompassing both months in that closure, spread the burden of conservation on all user groups. Instead of just, if we just close it in December, it would be all on Unit 6 residents to shoulder the burden of conservation. Some people have said they wish that we would have waited for snow, but snow doesn't give people time to plan. I felt like people needed time to plan, and especially commercial operators need time to plan. They need to know whether or not they can book clients, and they're all trying to make a living. Just like commercial fishermen like time to plan too, everybody likes time to plan. So now that I've explained to you what I do, what I can do, what I can't do, I'd like to talk with you all about what you can do. So, first off, reporting your harvest. You can do that either with your harvest ticket, reporting online, anytime. During fishing game hours, you can call me and Sam, and we'll close out any harvest report you've got. If you're just not sure, just get us the information. Also encourage your friends to report, share their observations. Any observations that you have are great. I love to learn as much as I can from people. I've been here just 6 months, but some of you have lived through numerous generations, and there's so much that I can learn from you. I don't want to come here and tell you that I have all the answers. What I wanted to do tonight is just explain to you what we have, how we make decisions, but a big part of that is engaging local people that have a wealth of knowledge and getting them to share it with me. So, I love to have information about body condition, sex ratios, and fawn production. Before we talked about focusing all of our harvests on males this year after November 1, I wanted to talk to people about buck-doe ratios and what they were seeing in buck-doe ratios. I also wanted to talk to them about whether or not they were seeing late spotted fawns. Sometimes if people are seeing late spotted fawns, it can be a sign that females are having a tough time finding a worthy buck and they're foregoing breeding for a couple estresses. And if you see late spotted fawns, that can be an indication that you don't have very many bucks in the population. That's something that we have to be careful of too. But I talked to people about it and they said, no, don't think that's really a problem, not something we've seen. Observations of lots of dead animals, that's what we got after the winter of 2011 that was really valuable. And then diseased and otherwise abnormal animals, and then weather in portions of Prince William Sound, especially those areas where we don't really look. And then finally, just getting involved with your local on fishing game issues. If you care about something, talk to me about it. Share your thoughts. I love to talk to people about these things. And then ultimately, if you want to see proposals to the Board of Game, I can help people to draft proposals. Even if I don't agree with your proposal, I will help you put it together and make it as strong as possible. It's part of my job. But our local advisory committee is a great way to talk about issues and be involved in that process. And they're going to meet on Thursday, 7 o'clock there this morning. And at this time, I guess I'd like to see if anybody has any questions.
You're right.
Yeah.
Why did the location specificity change on your harvest reporting forms?
Well, it's
How is that useful to the management? It sounds like it's frustrating for you.
It is frustrating for me. So basically, when someone picks up an overlay or harvest ticket to go deer hunting, it's a statewide harvest ticket. So you don't know if they use it for Prince William Sound or Kodiak or somewhere in Southeast. When we sent that survey, we included a bunch of other materials, and they could use that to respond the way that with the level of detail that we needed. But the way the harvest report's set up, there's no way for them to pick from a box of options. We couldn't put all those options, Prince William Sound to everywhere, because it's just a piece of paper they get when they get ready to go hunting. So the burden's on them to figure out what we need, and there's a wide variety of interpretations for that. Some people think it's none of my business to know where they went hunting. And some people just don't know that it's important to be as specific as you can. So it would be better. The advantage of the survey approach was that you could tailor the information that you needed. And the harvest ticket is a more rigid tool. But I do like the fact that you get I get more information from more people than what that sample was. The less I have to expand numbers and do, tweaking to find out what's representative, the better. So the harvest ticket system at least gets me that, but the best I can do is educate people about what I need.
A lot of areas you hear that there's so many deer per square miles on surveys. Was there ever an idea on how many deer per square mile?
No, nobody, you know, at some point in the game, somebody said 20,000 to 30,000 or something like that for a population, you know, estimate, but I think that's just a swag. Just a wild ass guess.
And Charlotte, we talked a little bit about this before, I'm just going to save this for Thursday.
You still can, but this is my
No, I think it's just, I want to kind of throw it out there. One of the things that we didn't talk, or you didn't talk about tonight, was a management plan. Something that helps you do your job, gives the public some degree of expectation about what's going to happen, maybe incorporates some of the social concerns along with some of the concepts of wildlife management we talked about tonight. Do you see that, I know we operate with very limited information with our deer compared to our moose, but would it be helpful, or do you see the need to develop a management plan for deer? Or is there something left over out there that we're unaware of in terms of the plan?
There's not a population management plan. We have goals and objectives. Goals and objectives, it's basically like 20 to 30,000 deer in the population, 60% bucks in the harvest, and 2,000 to 3,000 harvest in a year or something like that. But all of that is swags. It's all, and there's no teeth to any of it either, because there's nothing that says to me, okay, Charlotte Westing, you didn't get 60% buck harvest, you got 40% buck harvest. What are you going to do about it? There's none of that. And honestly, I think with the problems that we have with we don't have an estimate, and usually management plans have triggers. And what people want with a management plan is they want to know when you get to a certain point what triggers action. And if you don't know where you are, you don't know what action needs to be triggered. We don't know where we are with the harvest precisely. We don't know where we are with the estimate of the population. I think a more productive exercise is for me to talk with advisory committee members, people in the community, about what they want. I talked to people pretty extensively about this closure before it happened. Pretty much anybody that came in and snagged a deer harvest ticket, I tried to pull them in my office and run by it with them. And I know a number of you I talked to, and just see what they thought about what we wanted to do. I think those kinds of conversations and that kind of a process will be much more productive than trying to lock something in stone that's based on numbers that we don't really have and actions that at the end of the day, I'm not really sure that we'd really end up with something. And, looking at this year as an example, if there was ever a year to take management action, it would be argued for this year. And if there was a management plan in place, it would be in place to respond to years like we saw following the 2011, 2012 snow event. So, I don't think a management plan would change that.
Back in, I think it was 98 or 68, there was 2 really high snowfall years. Do you know if the doe seasons were closed after those big snow events like it?
I looked a little bit in the files for 98 and didn't find anything, but, I don't even know how much the biologist here at the time was using. I guess it was Roy. He was probably using computer fair enough. I wasn't able to find one real quickly, but I didn't do a real exhaustive search for what kinds of management actions have been taken. I know that in general, we don't want to respond to something until it was a big deal. Because there's so much fluff or uncertainty with what we do, we don't want to restrict opportunity until we know that things are really looking grim. And just the sheer amount of phone calls I have, and the number of people I've talked to that have said, gosh, you got to do something about this, say that it was seen as a significant concern. But I'm not sure for 1998, and I won't tell you what I was doing in 1998. Anybody else?
Do you see this as a one-year management? I mean, your management, closing things down. Next year, you see it possibly doing the same?
You know, I think it has a lot to do with what kind of weather we get. So basically, when I was talking about those oscillations in animal populations, what I didn't mention is just that when times are really good, you make hay and you harvest a lot, and then when times are bad, that's when you back off, and that's when you make your investment and hope that it pays off with returns later on. So that's what we're doing right now. We know our population's low. We know the likelihood of additive harvest is high, and we want to avoid that. 2011 was a different deal because the population was so high. We knew that there was a lot of snow. People shot a lot of deer that year. I think the harvest estimates for that year are artificially low, especially among Unit 6 residents. So anyways, we've got to kind of seize the moment and do what's appropriate for where we think our population's at. So population has been low. People are saying that it looks better this year than it did last year. I'm also getting a lot of reports again of really good body conditions, so that's all really good. I think if we leave some pregnant females in the population and have a real good fawn crop next year, if we don't have real severe winters, you can recover pretty quickly. It could be within 3 to 8 years. I can't speak right now to what will happen in the future, but I'm saying conditions are looking pretty favorable for it to be making a good recovery. So I can't lock in and say we're not going to have any kind of closure next year, but it's a whole lot less likely next year than it was for this year. In the face of the data that we had in front of us this year, there was an expectation for action. I think it was warranted.
With the option of less tags as compared to
A bag limit restriction? So the reason why we opted for, restricting harvest on female is just to get maximum bang for your buck. Because each of those, so to speak, because many of those females are pregnant, and when you leave them in the population, you get 2 for the price of 1. And then also just recognizing the importance of deer as a food resource for people in Cordova. The 5-animal bag limit and allowing an extensive season on bucks seemed like the best way to go. Bag limit reductions could make a difference to, it's just, I don't think most people that are going out right now are taking their full bag limit anyways. I think most people are just taking a couple. So functionally, I don't think that would have had as much of an impact as if we know 40% of our harvest is does, if we can reduce some of that, and if they're taking fewer animals, I think it has, again, more bang for the buck. Anything else?
You mentioned that the deer were introduced fairly recently, within the last century or so. Do they have any predators around here, or just us?
Well, bears will eat deer, but that's pretty much, bears, people, mainly people though, and then they die from weather.
What about restocking from other places?
Yeah, the time period of animal reintroductions, moving around and amplifying numbers is pretty much gone. There was that window, when the moose were introduced here, when the deer were introduced here, it was a different era of game management where people were more looked upon that more favorably than now, where I think it would be a very tough, if not impossible, sell.
doing something like that for moose?
Introduce more
Genetic
moose?
diversity?
Well, what we have there is a situation where we may be pushing up against the edge of what habitat can support. So introduction at any kind of level isn't necessarily something that's compatible, but that's a conversation we should have either at the meeting or when we're focused on those.
In 1998, when we had that big snowfall, we also didn't have the roads from Anchorage to Whittier, or the hunting pressure that we had from Anchorage. And so what you're seeing now is how these, I'm not saying these as like I'm picking on them, but so the sport harvest shrimp people from Anchorage to get away with their 5 pots, they get commercial shrimp licenses so they can fish 40 pots. So what I'm trying to say is if you get 1,500 deer harvested in Cordova, or Prince William Sound residents, they're only harvesting 600. There's 700 or 900 harvested from Anchorage and outlying areas. So is there any way to slow that down? Because they're coming. That's a freight train.
So one interesting thing in reference to the Whittier Tunnel, I've looked at that a little bit, and I expected to see a big spike when the Whittier Tunnel opened in our harvest, and I didn't see it. It's not there. So I don't know how those users were getting to Prince William Sound, but the data suggests they were finding a way. So that's interesting. Don't see the spike there. It's a little bit counterintuitive, and I don't quite know what to make of that. But there is not a way for the state to restrict harvest opportunity based on where you live. My obligation is to provide, to serve the people of Alaska regardless of where they live. The exception to that rule is when you get to Tier 2 status. And because this is an introduced species, because we don't have a good way of assessing the population, we're probably never going to get to Tier 2 status. So.
Okay, how did they, this might be a stupid question, but how did they do that with the moose project? I know this might be a complex thing. So all of a sudden, they got it used to be a state-only moose harvest. Then we went to where the Fed side took over, and the drawing kind of split up where there's more Fed moose than there is to keep it locally.
That has to do with the amount of federal land and state, and Milo might be able to speak to this better since he's been around a lot longer.
Yeah, Cordova has a customary traditional use determination for deer like it does for moose. In moose, the population is more limiting. There's fewer to go around, and a drawing hunt was necessary, and it was very easy to put a chunk of that into all federal management. With deer, there generally is enough to go around for everybody where we don't need to do a special subsistence harvest, only for deer. This year, I think we saw it in the best interest to restrict users the same. If she closed the season for state hunters, it would have had no impact on Hawkins Island. Almost all the harvest on Hawkins Island takes place by Cordova residents. And for that reason, because the graphs showed the same decline in the population, whether it was on Hawkins or elsewhere, I thought it was important to do it in subsistence as well. We could have a priority. We could, at times, have a longer season or a greater bag limit, but I thought it was the right thing to do in federal subsistence regulations as well.
Sean, one thing that could, just to build on that other question of, why you were saying the harvest didn't increase when the tunnel opened for vehicles is the fuel price started going up too. You've got to drive far with the boat from Whittier to get to a deer.
Right, no, that's a good point.
And there's every year there's less and less boats going further out. And the fuel price is the only thing that's changing.
Right, that's a very good point.
Consistent.
Death, taxes, and fuel prices. Certainty. Anybody else? Questions? Well, I'd like to just open my door. Some of you I've met, some of you I haven't, but this community's been very welcoming to me so far, my family so far. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy for any of you to come and talk to me about what you're seeing, talk to me about your specific questions, what you want to see, why we do the things we do. I don't want to have there to be mystery about what the department does and how. I want to be transparent. So keep that in mind and stop on by. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.